So welcome to our Dharma time. We're going to discuss tonight the Brahmaviharas and also a concept called uncoloring your thoughts. I'll leave you in suspense about what that is for right now. And I'm going to ring the bell so we can go to silence together. As we sit in quiet together, I do welcome you to really enjoy the quiet period. Many of us in the room know that for generations, people have relied on silent sitting or contemplation or even meditation to experience life through the heart, through awe and grace and presence. And though we sit in silence, of course, you may not experience your own mind as silent or as balanced or graceful. So bring your mental attention to something tangible that can anchor you in the preciousness of this moment. That may be the felt sense of your hands against your knees, or perhaps the air entering and exiting your nose. Something consistent, available, not too overcharged, relatively neutral. Notice how your mind has responded to the invitation to be present to something simple, tangible, available. And now quietly bring your awareness to the experience you're having with your eyes. I'm going to recommend that whatever you notice about the eyes, invite them to relax a few degrees, to release any habit or tension, the residue of stress or thought. Even soften the place between your eyebrows and at the corners of your eyes. And relax the place behind your eyes as well. Asha, would you please make sure the front door is open? Now, as you soften your eyes for a few moments, I'd like you to say to the sense of sight, thank you for the efforts that you've made to be alert on my behalf. Thank you. Right now, I invite you to rest. Invite your eyes to be at rest. In a similar way, bring your awareness to your nose, your sinuses, your cheeks. And to the nose, you might also say, thank you for the efforts you've made to provide me with information. Right now, we invite the senses to rest, so eyes and nose can be at ease. And soften the cheeks and the muscles that surround the cheeks. And notice the nuance of sensation that is experienced as you release your eyes and your nose, sinuses, cheeks, the corners of the eyes. And you may bring some attention to your tongue and invite the muscle of the tongue to relax. And for whatever taste happens to be present, to be something you notice mindfully but without judgment. And you can also say to the tongue and the experience of taste, you may say thank you for the efforts you've made to provide me with information. Right now, we're resting. As you soften the tongue, include with that the hinge of your jaw and the muscles of your throat. And with appreciation for the eyes, the nose, the tongue, now likewise for the ears, invite the inner ears to relax, and towards each of the ears you can say, thank you for the efforts you've made on my behalf to provide information. Right now, all is well, and we are resting. So we say to these senses, there's no need to scan for danger or threat. There's no need to hang on the past or anticipate the future. Right now, the senses can be at ease. Eyes, nose, tongue, ears. And for any moment that your mind wanders into habit, just quietly guide it back. The eyes, nose, tongue, ears. Invite your senses to be at ease. And now, with appreciation for your efforts to practice like this, and also for your efforts to be here this evening, please join your hands together in Anjali Mudra. And with your exhale, you may bow your head to your heart. Release both hands and open your eyes. So I'd like to have any input at all from you about how that was to sit quietly with very little structure, and then to have some invitation for how to focus. What did you notice? You noticed nothing? Or you went into the zone?
I struggled. And like letting go of the senses.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
Yeah.
The senses are so powerful. They get a lot of mention in yoga, in the philosophy of yoga, and in the teachings of Ayurveda.
Yeah.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
You had mentioned, like at one point, about breathing in through your nose and noticing the air movement. And then you went back to that a little bit later, and by the time you had gone back to that, my mind had already completely drifted. I was like, oh, yeah.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. Yeah. Yeah. That's very normal. We're not recommending that necessarily, but it's normal, so we accept that it happens. And without a scathing narrative, we come back. Yeah. What else did you notice?
I actually found my mind wandered less when I had something to focus on.
Yeah.
Then you just sit in silence and then it goes.
So was the direction for the senses helpful for you in staying present?
Yeah.
Mm-hmm.
And each one, I found each one in turns, you can say, let go of your senses. Okay, yeah, you're still sitting there spinning, but taking one time, I was able to set some of the spinning gears aside.
Yeah. Mm-hmm. Like one little mention as a suggestion is not enticing enough to the habit of mind to settle itself down. So one has to be consistent. That is, I have to be consistent, and as you have to be consistent towards yourself and towards your mind habits and your senses and your brain. Mm-hmm. Yeah. Anything else that you noticed? Yes?
There's a certain sense of vulnerability when you shut those things down. And you mentioned you're safe here, whatever, but you have to convince yourself of that, because when you shut those things down, you're shutting information down.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, and so that's really interesting for you to say how you heard me teaching was to shut those things down. So I recommended that you let them rest. And so those are very different things to do. So I'm just reflecting back to you that how that got interpreted from here to there was that we should shut the senses down, or that I'm asking you to shut the senses down. And I do think our senses are overstimulated, and I'll talk more about that in a few moments. And inviting them to rest could be an opportunity for relief. But you make a really good point. The senses play a role. And because the senses are first primally programmed to help you interpret threat or danger and to see to it that you don't make poor decisions, they have an active role in your survival. It's not by chance that the nose and the mouth are so close together. Because before you ingest food, if it smelled really terrible, you wouldn't eat it. So the sense of smell we might think of as relatively benign, and yet when you smell something that's palatable odor, you don't eat it. We hope you don't eat it, except people do eat blue cheese for some reason I can't figure out. This is really distasteful to my sense of smell and also to my taste buds. I can't do it. But the nose and mouth are close like that, and of course the ears are on the side of the head so we can hear in certain directions. And our eyes are here for seeing and perceiving, but also because we can experience empathy through the eyes with each other. So we don't have the eyes of the halibut. Fortunately. Those eyes apparently shift position as well from one part of the halibut body to another part. Yeah. But we have these senses available to us, and though they're first programmed for our survival, they also have a role in pleasure and in presence. When you smell something that's exquisite and you're actually just smelling it, for a moment you immerse yourself in that fragrance and the mind chatter subsides. However, if you smell it and then you find yourself craving more of that, you go from just the innocence of smell to the experience of craving, desire, compulsivity, and grasping. It just goes on a spectrum, and it can go relatively quickly in that direction. Similarly with taste, and I was recently teaching at Brighton Bush Hot Springs, and we had some students come from out of town. Quite a number of times they were coming from Wisconsin, Indianapolis, Canada, and so on. And one of the students asked about the foodie culture here in Portland, and his question specifically was, do people in Portland actually cook? Don't they just eat out, he said. This man was from Wisconsin, so he said, don't you guys just eat out all the time because the food culture is so big here? Now, of course, that's to say that we enjoy the flavors, the tastes, and the feeling in the body. We're seeking pleasure when we do that. So Ayurveda says there are 6 tastes available and that we do crave them all, and having the 6 tastes satisfied makes us feel more satiated when we've eaten something. But the point is to say, first, the senses are for our survival, and second, for our experience of pleasure. And yet we tend to heighten our pursuit of pleasure through the senses, and also to strategize our avoidance of what the uncomfortable or aversive things are. So we get onto that pendulum between aversion and grasping, aversion and grasping. And as much as our mind then gets on that pendulum, our biochemistry, our senses, our neurology do the same thing. We're hooked up to that particular cadence, back and forth, back and forth. So once we've experienced a little overactivation of the senses and we have a heightened alertness or apprehension about, we can actually keep that going, and it changes your biochemistry enough that your brain and your mind will start justifying that you have a watchtower in the eyes, the ears, the tongue, the nose, the skin, that you're basically on lookout all the time. It will justify that that's important and that's the way to be. But our senses were meant to interpret sort of like short-term danger, and we weren't meant to live in a system where we were chronically feeling like we're under siege. Of course, our lives are much busier now, and the planet is more crowded than when yoga began. And so it is more complicated on the one hand. On the other hand, it's the same mental conditioning in the human brain that our ancestor yogis had too. We have more privileges and more access to things than they did. So the struggles that we face are different, but I do think our senses in a way are right now much more overwhelmed than they're intended to be. And some of that is the onslaught of technology and the busyness of the mind that busies the brain, that busies the senses to be on the lookout for pleasure, to avoid pain, and on the lookout for survival first, and then joy second. So that being said, once your mind gets conditioned like that, you start to lean into what the Brahmaviharas call the near and far enemies, which I'll talk about in a few minutes. And those are conditioned mind states. Certainly, that's understandable. Fortunately, there are solutions, or there's avenues for relief. But prior to the Brahmaviharas being mentioned in the Yoga Sutras, we are told that there are things we can do to take a look at how our mind is working and how we can have more stewardship with the mind. I don't like the word control very much. In fact, I've said this before, when I first read the Yoga Sutras, and I read the second sutra in a translation that basically what it said in black and white terms was, when the cessations of the mind cease, you'll experience yoga. And similar to when I said shutting down versus restoring, I read that when the cessations of the mind cease, you will experience yoga. And I quickly closed the book and didn't keep reading. It didn't seem possible, and it wasn't desirable to think of my mind sort of ceasing all activity so that I could experience yoga. That wasn't what got me interested in the practice of yoga, and I hadn't any mentorship for reading the texts of yoga, so I read that and closed the book and kept doing asana and pranayama and chanting and meditation, and also cooking and hiking in nature and looking for the joy and contentment available in life through the lens of awe rather than shame, which was a significant turning point in my own life. Many years later, I opened the book up again and I read a different translation, and it said, in poetic terms, it said, when the fluctuations of the mind are less problematic, you'll experience grace. I was like, well, yeah, right on. I had already tasted that, and so that seemed pretty compatible with my direct experience, and I kept reading the book. So further on in the sutras, in the first pada, which means the first chapter, Patanjali basically says, look, if you're still having trouble with what I've suggested in the second sutra, there are some other suggestions I can make, and one of them he calls uncoloring your thoughts. So let me give a little context for this so it makes some sense. If you were to be dyeing fabric, and you put it in the red dye, and you left it in there for quite some time, you could have a very deeply colored piece of fabric, very red, deep red, saturated completely. Then you pull the fabric out of the dye, you rinse it, dry it, and wear it. It's very deeply colored as the dye was red. If you take that red cloth and put it in the yellow dye, it's hard for the yellow to overcome the red. And then you take it from the yellow and you put it in the green, and it starts to have a muddy color. So we might in a way take one part of our conditioned mind and put it in another part of conditioning, and then add another conditioning and keep adding conditioning. And we might be seeking better conditioning all along the way. But actually yoga is recommending that we lessen the conditioning, lessen the coloring, and experience ourselves as we were meant to experience pre-conditioning and beneath conditioning. So uncoloring your thoughts is actually the process of lessening the intensity of conditioning. A lot of our thoughts are conditioned. Let me ask you, and I know people who hear this on the internet can't see what I'm about to do, but what does this particular muscle pattern remind you of? Mm-hmm. Yeah. You recognize that because you've seen it, so your mind was conditioned to recognize that's called smoking. I'm not even a smoker. I've never smoked a cigarette, so I'm just mimicking my parents who were heavy smokers. But you recognize that as smoking. What is this one?
Refrigerator.
Yeah, you've done it. Right? At some point, you've opened the fridge and stood there looking. So you recognize, even though that was a very simple charade, you recognize that it's happened before. So your muscle memory related to my muscle memory, and you can see it in action, and you remember in your own conditioning that's called opening the refrigerator and standing there. Okay. So conditioned mind in a way can be really helpful because you found your way to the yoga studio today, and you used memory, and muscle memory was a part of that. But conditioned mind that keeps certain thoughts in play becomes really painful. So yoga is recommending that we lessen the coloring of the conditioned mind. My experience over some 25 years with yoga and with community like this, and by the way, it's so great to be together. Thank you for coming. My experience of this is we'd like to work on the smaller thoughts first, on the more simple thoughts, the less conditioned thoughts, the ones that are easier to practice on. Let's call those warm-up poses. Like in yoga, we have the warm-ups before the bigger poses. It's a great way to practice. But at some point, you have to move out of the warm-up poses into the more complex parts of your conditioned mind. But I'm going to try a warm-up question with you right now. If you could just reflect for a few minutes on some thoughts you know you've outgrown. They're no longer so colored for you. They aren't quite so conditioned anymore. they don't have the same stick, and they can't arouse your brain quite as much. Your biochemistry is less interested. What might some of those thoughts be?
Are you hanging out with the cool people?
Mm. So that's less colored for you now. And was it at one time very strongly colored?
Oh, high school.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
What band's playing this weekend?
Uh-huh.
It's like a contest.
Uh-huh. So that's less colored for you now.
Yeah,
Mhm.
way.
Mhm.
Breaking up with a significant other
Mhm.
over time gets less.
Yeah. So I'm interpreting that like this. Some painful breakup historically had a strong residue initially, and then it gets less and less of that residue, so it's less colored. The lens you look through at that life event is less painful. Is that right?
Yeah.
Yeah. Yeah. Are there other ones?
But I have to do everything right.
Oh, amen. It's good to outgrow that one. That's exhausting. Mhm.
And false, but impossible. But
Yeah. It actually wasn't ever true. It might have felt really compelling at a certain time. It can give shape to your life and some structure, right? But it wasn't true, and you found out soon enough that it's not worth pursuing. Mm-hmm. Yeah.
It's okay to go to bed early, you're not going to miss out on anything.
Yeah. It's okay to go to bed early. It's okay to nurture your body, right? Like the conditioned thought in our culture about the body is much more objectified than it is embodied. It's the way that I hear people talk about the physical body, when they talk about their own body, and I'm specifically talking about your relationship to yourself. I'm not talking about mass objectification in the media and marketing. But when people talk to me about their physical body, they're like, it has a problem, my hip has an issue, my foot has an issue, this is what's wrong with my body isn't keeping up the way that I wanted it to, now I'm experiencing these symptoms, and they're really kind of annoying to me. And so if you listen to that, if you step back from that just a few degrees, what you hear is somebody objectifying the body rather than embodying, like dwelling in. This is body intelligence here and available for us to explore our life through. But we were conditioned to have the body a bit objectified. So we might be outgrowing that lens by practicing yoga, and certainly realizing we can go to bed early because the body is giving you a nudge in that direction. And missing out on something on the outside world is actually nurturing your deep sleep on the inside world. It goes a lot farther for self-care. Mm-hmm. Are there any others that you can think of?
I've got a whole slew of them. But I'll just say I'm too fat. Used to be one.
Mm-hmm.
What was
So
that?
that's less colored for you now.
Oh, totally.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
I didn't hear.
And too fat.
Mm-hmm. And that also goes with objectifying your body and, looking at the media, looking at yourself as an object that should fit according to what the media says, or looking upstream at our genetics, or hearing messages from parents or coaches or athletic influences and so on. Yeah, but that's less colored for you now.
It's like zero colored and everything. I mean, it's, yeah.
Mm-hmm. And so for those of you, including Pamela who just said that, is it less painful to live with the less colored thoughts?
yes.
Yeah.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, yes.
I was just going to say, this is really similar to Pam's, but it's like so life-changing that I no longer feel guilty for not being at the gym or anything I eat. Like 5 years ago, it ruined my life 24/7. I just had this constant guilt, and now I don't even really think about those things, and it's like definitely the biggest one that I've ever overcome.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. That's a major celebration. Mm-hmm.
Yeah, I threw guilt out the window.
But something had to occur for each of you along the way. A change, not just a change of mind and heart, but also a biochemical change had to accompany your willingness to see those thoughts be less important. It was a change of perspective, a change of mind, a change of heart, but also a biochemical availability to risking a new way of seeing. Because when we picked up those colored thoughts, then we kept conditioning them so they were more deeply red or more deeply green, more deeply colored. It was reinforcing a perspective and creating a biochemical change in us, like the urgency to go to the gym or to judge every piece of food that you might have put in your mouth. That had a biochemical impact. So something had to change along the way. Do you know how you contributed to that change, or how it came to be for you? What about for you, Jess?
Mine was a lot of cognitive behavioral therapy and just changing the messages and creating new neural pathways, I guess, if you get technical with the terms. But yeah, it was a lot of work, but it was really worth it.
Mm-hmm. Was there somebody helping you with that?
I did books, and then I went to a therapist that is like an angel. I love her.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, and so that's a really important component, that you had a wise guide or a wise companion. So I want to bookmark that here for just a moment. What else occurred so that you could actually see yourself growing into the possibility of lessening the coloring of a painful thought that you were actually committed to?
Well, for me, it was there was a change in about the last 10 years or so. Maybe it was related to my isolation from friendships, related to caregiving to my mother, but I actually found a positive experience when I shifted from the focus of quantity of relationships versus quality of relationships. And it came about probably kind of not really a planned way, but just because of that isolation. I think I realized I had only so much time, precious time, and so if I was going to dedicate that precious time somewhere, it wasn't to the quantity of people I was sharing a relationship with, but it was the quality of people. And I think it resonated for me that I got closer to who I really am and the people I really want to have in my life, you know, up to that point, you know.
Yes. Yeah, and so though it might have been demanding and time-consuming and emotionally challenging to care for your mom and to see some of your vitality get diminished by that process, you actually got really important information from your body's wisdom about quality instead of quantity. And it's relational, so I'm going to bookmark that also because there's a hopeful discovery here. So, thank you. Were you going to say something?
Yeah, I was just going to say also too, I had a counselor and therapy at the time. This was a long time ago. Seems now, but then I just really got into, I think the key point was realizing that I played a victim to myself, and then taking ownership of my life, and really over like 20 years focusing on creating my own reality and thinking positive and helping others along that way too helped me see that also.
Right, and so you touched on it again without actually saying it, but I'm going to highlight this now, that part of how the change was able to occur was relational. There was a wise guide or another companion or a chance to be of help to somebody, or there was empathy provided, or there was some camaraderie somewhere, or you had a new way of seeing something and you might have intersected with somebody else who reflected that back to you. We essentially have social brains and we rely on empathy and understanding to risk growing. And it so supports your biochemistry to come back to health and vitality and capacity that it's essential that we figure out how we could seek out even self-empathy when needed, self-compassion, self-kindness, but also relational compassion, relational kindness, equanimity, and so on. And so what Patanjali says at this certain point in the sutras is like, look, your mind can be troubled. It can be disturbed, dull, distracted, one-pointed, or lucid. It's likely fed by the 5 kinds of knowing, which include misperception, fantasy, imagination, deep sleep, and clear perception. If you're caught up in any of the 4 inauspicious ways of knowing, you're probably producing disturbed, dull, and distracted mind states. And he outlines that in the sutras and says, essentially he says, I get it. This is the circumstance of having the human mind. Here are some solutions. And after providing a few solutions like lengthen your exhale or meditate on a single object, he says, okay, you're still reading. Maybe you haven't gotten it yet. Here's another sutra. Here's another suggestion. And it's at that point that he says, let's try the Brahmaviharas. And the Brahmaviharas are relational meditations. They're interpersonal suggestions. Now, I like to translate them as intrapersonal as well, so self to self, but they were generated as interpersonal. So without Patanjali saying it outright, he's basically saying, I have a hunch that humans have social brains and we need each other for our growth and evolution, including our spiritual evolution. So he goes on to say, here's these 4 Brahmaviharas, try them out. And by the way, if that's not working, well, okay, here's one more suggestion. He says, meditate on something really pleasant. And so that's where the senses turn towards pleasure become really helpful. So I'll come back to that later. Do you understand so far as I'm saying? The relational part of how you guys had a change of perspective was critical. Sometimes we don't see the relationship right away because, like, you were more isolated caring for your mom. But what happened to your biochemistry and caring for her and then her death and the depletion and the realization, that was all relational. Yeah. So I'll write in probably less good handwriting than I had earlier today. So the 4 Brahmaviharas, by the word Brahma, by the way, Brahma means divine and Vihara means abode. So they're the 4 divine homes for your heart, or the 4 divine abodes. They're considered qualities to develop, but they're also considered a reflection of your innate heart. Like, as you were born, prior to all the colorings of thoughts, prior to all this conditioning, you would have emerged into these qualities. And I'll add that out of pain and suffering, you can also choose these qualities. So you need not have like a perfect life spectrum to experience this. In fact, most of us don't. So we can say thank you to the pain we've been in because now we're asking for relief through these kinds of practices. So karuna, which means compassion. And then metta, also called mayatri, depending on if it's the language of yoga or the language of the Buddha, means loving kindness. And then mudita, which is my favorite one to say, I don't know why, but mudita means appreciative joy or happiness for somebody else's happiness. And upeksha, you can say upekshanam, means equanimity. And essentially by practicing those 4 qualities, or even really any one of them, to choose one, would lessen the coloring of your own thoughts. Here's an example. So compassion as a word, Kam means like in community or to be together, to be with, and passion means to suffer. The word compassion actually translated quite literally means to suffer with. Also means our capacity to suffer with another person's suffering. So given that translation for compassion, there's a realization that suffering happens, that human hearts and brains and minds are vulnerable to it. And we're being invited to suffer with someone else. That's pretty big. Now, let's say, for example, that you've had a great annoyance towards someone who's, maybe they're a relatively painful character on the planet. Maybe they're not that evolved, so they cause harm to other people. Maybe they had their own painful experiences, and those are deeply buried, so they look like sort of an angry tyrant of a sort of person.
Donald Trump.
Perhaps, yeah. I have compassion for his hair. And for his wife's experience of his hair. Which is it's really more like the near enemy called pity. I mean, I don't have a regular TV reception, so what I've seen of Donald Trump is it's either on YouTube or like a People magazine in the airport where I've seen those things. But let's say that there's sort of dark people out there and you happen to know some of them near or far, and you don't have an instinct first for compassion for them. You have an instinct for irritation or anger or annoyance with them because you've seen the harm they cause or the darkness that they bring or the way they cause pain or limitation for somebody else. Do you know people like that? So as you reinforce your perspective on that person, you deepen the coloring of your own thoughts about them. You deepen your perspective about them. We deepen our stance. We might call that in English justifying. I'm justifying how I feel, how I see this person. I can justify it elegantly in terms of social justice and yoga, and I could find a little platform to stand on about it. Now, who has the greater expense? Me, with my biochemical response to my own justifications, or the person that I find distasteful? Who is that costing more to? Me. Yeah. It costs more to me to stay in that stance. I'm also likely to be less effective at welcoming a solution. Some sort of intuition could rise if I wasn't so tangled by my own colored thoughts. So when I stand against the other, in this model, compassion would be to stand with the other. Standing against, the far enemy of compassion is called cruelty. I'm standing against, and I wish harm for that person. I wish that he or she would get it, how bad a person they are, how unskillful they are, to use a better word about it. I'm not being recorded, so I hesitate to use my New Yorker phrases.
Asshole.
That was one that came to mind. Yeah. That's heavily conditioned for me. Yeah.
As a New Yorker, I could not say it.
Yeah, I know, right. It's like a knee reflex. The doctor hits the kneecap and the foot goes. And you think of people who cause unfortunate pain and suffering on the planet, and they do it seemingly blindly, and they seem ignorant to it, and even seem like proud and happy and privileged about it. And your response necessarily is just like the knee reflex. Anger might push forth. Part of that anger is an urge to protect vulnerable humans. So how will we most wisely protect other vulnerable humans if we're caught up in the anger and the strife and the biochemical surge that causes our perspective to be in cruelty, or for our perspective to be a hope for harm to come to that person? We won't be very effective that way. So what yoga is recommending is taking the perspective of compassion towards that person to liberate ourselves. This is so important that you get that the Brahmaviharas aren't about condoning somebody else's behavior. They aren't even about approving of the other person's behavior. It's not agreeing with it. It's not saying we think it's auspicious or wonderful. The Brahmaviharas are practices to liberate our own hearts, to come into more skillful relationship and more intelligent action. So to have compassion towards someone inevitably frees you of the deeply colored thoughts and gives you access to your intuition and wisdom. Sometimes people feel that could be, if a mass of people did that, it would be frightening because we'd all stop wanting to act. We might fall into peace, love, and harmony and not take action on the injustices in the world. That actually hasn't been my direct experience. My personal experience, and also watching in my community, is that when we come to compassion as a perspective, the way in which we want to act is more healing for the whole and less damaging for the person or persons to whom we want to act cruelly. It also spares us the strife of, say, having heartburn and stomach ulcers and colitis because we're so distressed about human nature. We can't act well if we're making ourselves ill with the suffering that we see. You're following okay? I see some nods of recognition. Mm-hmm. So compassion really, really at its heart is the practice of seeing the other and seeing yourself in the other. I think it was James Hollis who said about the shadow, that the shadow invokes in us our responsibility for the otherness in the other, which isn't actually otherness at all. It's ourselves being manifest in them. So the practice of compassion is to see that. So that takes a bit of personal research and vulnerability, to go back to your word, because let's take, for example, Donald Trump. You'd have to be able to sift down through the persona and the layers upon layers of stuff that look like Donald Trump and see the humanness underneath there. Maybe you'd see first human pain, confusion, you might then go, so I see arrogance. Well, look under arrogance and see where there's vulnerability, confusion, pain, or insecurity. And you might see power, hunger, and you look under there and see what is under the hunger for power, like maybe fragility or insecurity or vulnerability. So we keep sifting down to see where are the places where there's a kind of self-to-self experience, not a self and other experience, but self unto self. So we suffer with, we understand, we empathize with. There was a question.
You just touched on it here, but you also mentioned it on a retreat. You mentioned this surge, and you called it flooding on your retreat. So I wonder if either, we are flooding, or a person that we're with is flooding or having that surge. How do we best navigate either ourselves in that, flood or someone else?
Like flooding is also synonymous perhaps with when you get triggered. And when she's saying flooding, what I'm usually referring to, so correct me if I'm saying something other than I said before.
Oh, I just used the word you used on your retreat.
Yeah, so like our brain gets flooded with the chemicals of urgency, emergency, stress, and panic. So for those who want to know, that's your HPA axis, and some other biochemicals surge in there too. So hypothalamic pituitary adrenal axis rushes in, and you literally do get flooded with the biochemistry of that stress reaction. So you're asking what to do if that's happening for me or for somebody else?
Yeah, obviously noticing it is the first step, but if we feel that we are starting to flood, or we're with someone that you can tell just flooded,
Yeah.
what are steps or things, I guess, using compassion to kind of, get out of that alive?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, that's a good use of the phrase. Because it does feel like a survival moment. So she said, how do we get out of that alive? My first recommendation actually is tenderness. Adding irritation to the circumstance will not be helpful. Making somebody else feel bad or wrong, or making yourself feel bad or wrong for getting flooded will not be helpful. So my first recommendation is tenderness. The second recommendation might sound a little bit out there for some of you, but it's to bring a quality of curiosity to the flooding, to ask yourself, how is my history made present right now? What of my past just came into the present moment? What just got aroused that has lived for a long time in me, that is conditioned to be terrified right now? So I'm asking in IPNB terms, what of my implicit memory just surfaced that makes me feel more terrified than I know how to handle? Do you understand? If we ask that question, it's actually more honest. We may not get the cognitive answer, but when you get flooded, quite likely your most implicit memories are there. And what we experience in our precognitive time, this is before we're 2.5 or 3 years old, if we experience a rush of that kind of biochemistry, we also experience a coexisting helplessness, overwhelm, and terror. So when you get flooded today as a grown-up, if it feels like helplessness, overwhelm, and terror again, it's quite likely that your implicit memory is coming along for the ride and might actually be asking you for that moment of tenderness, curiosity, for the purpose of healing some of that original terror and overwhelm. Now, it only takes one person to turn to a mutual flooding. It only takes one of us to turn to that with tenderness. Drop into the belly breathing. Come back to curiosity. It just takes one person to do it. Now, sometimes what you do is you say, I'll risk it for a second. And if he or she doesn't come along, forget it. That's not very skillful because it takes longer. Like, how much time does it actually take once the police siren goes by on the highway and you realize that you're not the one getting pulled over? How long does it take for that biochemical surge to go down? 1 second?
Yeah.
No. Now, the realization that it's not you getting pulled over is pretty quick, but the biochemical echo goes on for a longer time. So that is to say, if you're going to choose tenderness in the interpersonal dilemma, but you want it to happen in a flash that you're both better, that's short-sighted. You might need to give it 23 seconds.
That's precise.
Yeah, I'm sure they've measured how long it takes. If we don't intercede on the flooding by saying, "Oh, thank God that wasn't me, because that could have cost me my mortgage if the policeman pulled me over," and yeah, he should be going after really bad guys, not me. If you don't tell the story, adding to it, how long does it actually take for that biochemistry to settle down?
So when
Yes.
someone has a PTSD moment
Mhm.
and they go into a rage and you're along with them, is that still, does it tenderness, is that the first thing that comes into action, is to deal with that person, is to help them kind of come down, to
Mhm.
realize maybe to recognize what's happening within them?
I would make the same recommendation. I will add to it in just a moment. But tenderness for that event is likely to spare you getting annoyed or terrified yourself. Curiosity about what's present for you and what might be present for them is going to keep you both more afloat. And finding ways to stabilize both of you in the present moment would be my next recommendation. And since we're not all in the room a particularly qualified therapists, and nor are you with your friends suggested to do therapy, how to stay in the present moment at that time. If you have enough relationship, you can use CBT, cognitive behavior strategies, to help somebody come back to the present moment. Like, what color are my shoes? And what color is my sweatshirt? What did we have for lunch today? Can you remember that? So you're just asking for really evidence-based, present moment statistics and short-term memory to ask them to come back to the here and now. Then you might be able to get some breathing and movement to help calm the brain down. I wouldn't try to dissect somebody's PTSD event with them or for them, unless you are a trained therapist and they've asked you to do so. Do you understand?
I understand what you're saying, but living with my father and seeing him go through a range and still go through those range from Vietnam, going and doing that for a couple of years, which has all kinds of, like, he's the poster child for PTSD.
Yeah.
And to, like, so there's no way for me not to be in his presence. So
Yeah.
So it's just, I just wonder how to relate to him
Mhm.
when he has a manic attack or a stressful moment, which he
Mhm.
has.
Yeah. We must have dads that are about the same age, because my father is also a Vietnam vet, and he has also had his challenges. So what I would turn us towards in looking here then is compassion and equanimity. So equanimity is called upekshanam. You're asking about your own role in this regard. Before I leave compassion to go to equanimity, let me say I would recommend you build a team of people around your father, a community of sorts that he can turn to and that you can turn to, because you can't be alone in that responsibility. He's not experiencing the present moment when that happened, nor did he experience the PTSD in isolation. So it happened in the context of community, and it can be healed better in that context. So a team might be his exercise person, a nutrition person, friends who care and who are consistent, people who are more resilient and who come to compassion more often so they can raise his brain's capacity for that also. People who exude more love and optimism, or who see his goodness and see it regularly. My dad is very stabilized right now, but he was not up until I was about 33, which is 15 years ago, 14 years ago. So those are some of the elements that we had to put in place to help him. And he's remarkable. I'm not saying that that's going to be the same course for your dad, but we need to put things in place that give you a sense that there's a team and you're not alone. Mm-hmm. For being a daughter of a man who comes home from Vietnam, we both likely experienced primal terror at times as children that we couldn't explain, must have felt helpless to, sometimes powerless and overwhelmed. So even though you're now grown, your implicit memory will surge with some of that when you see your dad go into PTSD. So if that surges for you, you won't be able to be so helpful for him. And yet if it surges, you also need care and support and compassion for yourself. Do you follow what I'm saying there? Okay.
I do.
Mm-hmm. So in terms of equanimity then, to come to that, which is also like a synonym for how resilient can we be, how accepting can we be, how wide can the heart be in the world. Equanimity implies a quality of being able to surf the waves of life without having to collapse, grasp, push away, or turn a blind eye to. It's like the waves are coming and I'm able to stay open in what's happening. To build that for yourself, so when this might happen for your father in your proximity, to build this includes things like Beth stays hydrated and nourished. You have enough consistent empathy in your own life that your brain sort of swells with the capacity to stay regulated, to stay even-keeled, to stay open-hearted. And you nourish yourself often enough with that so that when there is a speed bump or a big tidal wave, you aren't so crashable or collapsible. Meeting your father from that place when he has an episode, you could end up being like a lighthouse for him, which is how it turned out for my dad and I, though he was a lighthouse for me first, which was a really like a remarkable landmark event. I couldn't have predicted it to happen. But that changed our relationship really dramatically. So if we build your resilience and equanimity, your sense of buoyancy, and you do need empathy to be a part of that. When you meet up with your dad's frightening parts, you'll be more likely to go to compassion and to feel stable in the process. I hope that helps some.
Yeah.
Mm-hmm. So the near enemy of compassion, just to clarify, let's say you slip into the near enemy, and by the way, the near enemy is likely to happen, and it tells you you're about to be at the fork in the road between the Brahmavihara and the far enemy. If you find yourself in the middle of the forest of your human mind at the near enemy, just consider it, I'm at a fork in the road, not like I'm a tragic failure and I can't believe I took yoga teacher training and I still have these thoughts. So the fork in the road right there at this near enemy for compassion is pity. If you find yourself feeling pity or sympathy for someone or for an aspect of yourself, you might say, I'm at the fork in the road right now. Pity might be my effort to come to compassion. If I just lean a little bit more left, could I feel compassion? But pity might also tell me I'm about to go into cruelty, which is the far enemy of compassion. So if you do find yourself experiencing pity, even towards an aspect of yourself, and I'm going to underline that phrase, pity towards an aspect of yourself can quickly become cruelty towards somebody else who expresses that aspect on the outside. And that won't feel good to you and your life values. So even if pity is towards some part of yourself, acknowledge it. I have a chance to take the fork in the road right now towards compassion with myself about this aspect with which I sometimes feel like responding with pity. Do you have parts of yourself that you feel like responding to with pity? Like, does the word pathetic ever come to mind? Is that from New York also? Pathetic? I don't know. You guys use that here in Oregon pretty regularly. Pathetic.
A different word in front of it.
Yeah. It's like the pre-word. Ashley knows what those are too. She's behind you. Yeah. Yeah. So if pity or pathetic comes to mind in your vocabulary, it's a really important time to relatively quickly shift your attention to compassion for yourself. Yes.
I think this is not about self, but I think about it, as you know, like I work with homeless people in a crisis setting, and I'd say like 3/4 of the people who I say the work that I do, they're like, oh, I feel so, that must be terrible.
Mm-hmm.
Those poor people, they don't have anything. And I don't, I obviously don't feel that way. I love the work I do and I feel compassionate for it, but the response that I get when people think of that is almost always pity.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. Yeah.
It just made me think of that.
Pity also keeps people a little bit distanced enough that they're not feeling the pain of the population that you work with. Pity is a little bit, for me, it's closer to condescension and like the hierarchy of this self looking down at that other. And compassion really is self to self without hierarchy. But it requires a quality of vulnerability to see ourselves in the self to self, like this homeless person's life, to see the vulnerability and the disadvantage or the loss of basic rights that they might have experienced to become homeless. That's really painful. How much do our senses and our brains and bodies have to tolerate that if we avert ourselves from it so consistently? we might need warm-up poses to get comfortable feeling compassion for that rather than going to pity and distance for it. Mm-hmm. Yes?
So that cruelty would move right into like the bullying, the whole bullying kind of attitude,
Yes.
wouldn't it?
Yeah. By the way, a place to warm up your sense of compassion for vulnerable beings is with homeless animals. I mean, if you can start there, I'm sorry to say it's a little cliche and so on and so forth, but we do have our heartstrings tugged on for the homeless animal, and can we see ourselves consciously practicing with the homeless dog or cat as a way to warm up to homeless persons and stop the sort of blame and shame relationship we have to that now. It requires great personal responsibility to see how we, as a community, create circumstances where those things happen. And great vulnerability to see it, and also compassion for the circumstances that we were born into. Like, this is the cultural times we were born to. What can we do to make a difference? We can't be very effective if we're stuck in pity or cruelty. Mm-hmm. Yes?
Just to add, I think it's interesting. I did a section of this in one of my philosophy classes. We talked about charity.
Yes.
Charity can be in the pity category and isn't very helpful if it's in that kind of category. If you're doing charity, it's like, well, I don't know. It's kind of hard to explain it. So it's interesting that charity isn't always helpful.
Right.
More condescending.
Yes. Yeah. So let's just take for a couple of minutes a really colored thought you might have towards which you don't right now have compassion. Maybe we could just use this example. I don't think we're going to get a lot of traction in this room, like homeless people deserve to suffer. How's that ring for you guys? Okay, that didn't work. That's not colored enough for you right now, right? How about you deserve to suffer? Is that still colored sometimes? Okay, that doesn't get a lot of traction either, so that's good news. What's that?
All the very rich people need to be poor.
Are we going to get traction on that one? Did that get traction with her?
Yeah, I think they should all experience it at least once in their life.
Mm-hmm. Right, so I'll have to, because the two that I proposed don't get a lot of traction, and I'm grateful for that, by the way. Those aren't the world lenses that you're looking through right now. But is there a thought that's pretty deeply colored that you don't think is worthy of compassion?
I have a hard time with stupid people.
Okay. Yeah. So that sort of sentiment, thank you, Leah, for being honest about it, that will cause the distance between you and them. We have a hard time with stupid people. So they're set over here, and we're here in the non-stupid category. So to have compassion be a bridge between those two, we'd have to be able to acknowledge our own occasional stupidity, ignorance, naivete, unskillfulness. Like, you start broadening out the synonyms for the quality you see in the other person that we just knee-jerk reaction might call stupid. Like, what else might be going on there? Okay. Does this make sense for the moment? Okay, I'm going to ask you to take a comfortable seat in some fashion that you feel like you could be meditative or contemplative in. It's okay if you early feel like you need to lie down. It's not always as effective, but I understand sometimes your body isn't inclined to be upright. You might close the eyes or have them be quietly cast down. And before we explore the concept where I'm taking us, let's come back to softening your eyes so that the expression of eyes that has been today can be appreciated and also surrendered. Relax the space between your eyebrows, at the corners of the eyes, and even the space behind your eyes. And to the eyes themselves, you can again say thank you for the efforts you've made today and for many prior days. Thank you. Right now, we're not going to scan for danger or threat. We're relatively safe, relatively resourced, relatively connected. We invite the eyes to rest. Notice the sensations of softening your eyes. Notice even the subtle sensations. And come to the nose, and you may say to the nose and the sinuses, the cheeks, thank you for the efforts you've made on my behalf today and many days prior. Right now, we're not scanning for danger nor threat. At this moment, we're relatively safe, relatively resourced. We have our basic needs met. And we're relatively connected. We invite the eyes and the nose to rest. And also to the tongue, bring your attention there. And as you relax your tongue or invite it to soften, welcome the hinge of your jaw to release any amount. And consider again a gesture of gratitude. Thank you to the tongue for the efforts it's made today on your behalf and on many days prior. Right now we aren't scanning for danger nor for threat. We're relatively safe, relatively resourced, and connected. Now as the eyes, nose, and tongue relax, for any moment during meditation that the eyes, nose, or tongue either flinch or harden, see if you might come back to this invitation to soften your senses as a way to, for these moments, soften your defenses, your guardedness, any amount at whatever degree you'd like to be working. And I invite you to bring to heart an aspect of yourself towards which you find yourself having judgment, pity. Maybe sometimes you even have the urge for cruelty towards this aspect of yourself. And perhaps this is only a historical experience now, and you could bring that to mind as well. Explore the possibility of bringing this aspect of yourself into your heart without judgment, with less aversion. even with a warm welcome. This may be a part of you that you struggle with today, with the voice of pity or cruelty or judgment. Or maybe an aspect of yourself that you've struggled with historically. As you bring this to heart, become more curious about the nuances of this experience. What are some synonyms for the other ways this expression manifests? What are some qualities or some guesses you might have about why this aspect of yourself emerges? You might ask, what possible role does vulnerability play, or fear? Notice your eyes, your nose, your tongue. And you can ask yourself, what might occur if you were willing to offer compassion towards this aspect? What might occur if you were willing to tenderly welcome this aspect of yourself, to be less distanced or less judged? Notice again your eyes, your nose, your tongue. And to this aspect of yourself that you've brought to heart, you may say now, thank you. Thank you for the efforts you've made to get my attention. You may say, thank you for the opportunity that I now have to practice compassion. If you're willing, offer a few moments of compassion towards this aspect of yourself. And notice any response in your eyes, your nose, or your tongue. When you feel inclined to do so, you may open your eyes if they're closed or lift your gaze if it's down. And if you're willing, a couple of you are willing to say something about your experience, that could be very helpful to somebody else, as well as appreciated by me.
So after, I guess, like what came to mind when it was something that it's hard to have compassion for in myself is my fear of like abandonment, not belonging.
I've done so much work with it, and I still get flooded sometimes by things that just aren't worth, there's no, logical reason why it should happen. And just being able to give compassion to myself for being human and wanting to belong, and that we're social creatures, and it's very natural.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. And I would strongly recommend that your compassion towards this part of yourself, that you actively see that part of yourself as very, very young.
I always call her like sweet girl.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. Yeah. Because I know some about your life history, having you told me directly, and because I know a lot about implicit memory and our brains and bodies, if you hold her as very young and see how quite naturally she would have been terrified, overwhelmed, confused, scared, sometimes lonely, and wouldn't know how to regulate that for herself, the actual most natural response towards that would be just like the compassion we'd have for a lost puppy. You'd want to pick it up and hold it. So if this part of you sometimes gets triggered in relationship now, as a biological now, when it gets triggered, it's a chance to heal this part of you that historically didn't have somebody to hold her, to see her, to love her, to have that space and great care and compassion for her. You can provide that now. You can also ask us to provide that for those of us who are close to you. It is an indwelling human need. So we need more than clothing and shelter and food. This is primal to us. You're welcome. Yeah. Anybody else? An experience you might have had this in the guided time?
I've mentioned before that I struggle with negative self-talk, particularly around my body. That's just kind of that's the environment I was raised in. That was how I was taught to regard my self-worth. And I'm not saying anything that's like, oh, this is unique to me and nobody else shares this. I know that this is a common phenomenon in our culture. So learning to have compassion for that and understanding that that's coming from a place of fear of rejection, fear of not fitting in, fear of not belonging, fear of not being happy too somehow, I think, like as if like happiness will come if, all of those things, seeing that from a place of tenderness is the exact opposite of how I've always regarded it, which is more like have to keep doing and focusing and obsessing and feeling bad for myself because that controls my life. So this is something I've been working on for months, and I feel like I'm finally getting to a place of finding the compassion and the tenderness like more readily.
Yeah. So the old thought is getting less and less colored, just to be specific, and a new thought is arising that's more lucid. So lucid thoughts are not colored in the sense that colored thoughts are deeply conditioned, but lucid, closer to love and grace and compassion, is also more honest. It's like it radiates out. So I heard two things. One is, to the extent that you can see this thought cluster of self-criticism towards your body, and you see surrounding it fear of rejection, fear of not being happy, fear of this, fear of that, you actually could practice a moment of tenderness or compassion towards each of those fears, because those are huge fears. I mean, they're part of that primal hunger I was just speaking to Kelsey about. It's really primitive instinct to need a sense that we belong. Primitive instinct to have a feeling that life can be hopeful. There can be some happiness or some optimism. We don't go on very well without that. So if you had moments of tenderness towards those aspects, it may loosen the grip that this one has had. She's, as a thought cluster, she's going to get outnumbered by the tenderness you have surrounding it. Now this thought cluster might have been powerful enough to keep you from entertaining your relationship to the other fears. So I do recommend softening the senses and then greeting those other fears. This one can be very distracting and powerful. And she was also trying to protect you. So you can tell her, thank you. I don't need that kind of protection anymore. I really appreciate what you've offered.
Yeah, it's the opposite of what I've usually approached it as, which is more like,
Out, damn, yeah. like in Shakespeare when they said out, damn spot, was that what the phrase was? Am I getting that? You know what I'm quoting, so I didn't get it right, at least you understand the intention. Yeah. So this is where compassion internally actually starts to flow into compassion externally also, and vice versa. If you have to practice on somebody else first, don't leave yourself out. Acknowledge that you're practicing compassion for this other person's tenderness or vulnerability or innocence or earnestness, but remind yourself that there's going to be a reciprocity. If you welcome it, you'll have reciprocity. So compassion, unsupervised vulnerability goes to pity. Supervised, acknowledged, honest vulnerability can go to compassion. And if there's no clarity or wisdom operating, pity goes very quickly to cruelty. We see that all over our planet right now. With Maitri, I'll just mention these ones. Loving kindness is the quality, the Brahmavihara, in which we can take refuge. And again, it's considered one of the Brahmaviharas, the divine abodes of the heart. Well, the near enemy for loving kindness is a prayer that somebody else experiences less suffering and more joy, more peace or harmony or more belonging. So we are offering this prayer towards someone who might have caused harm. Say, may you be free from unnecessary pain and suffering. May you know peace and joy. May you be free from unnecessary harm. May you know love and harmony. You offer this prayer towards someone that you might have seen either cause pain and suffering or who has harmed you. That's a pretty radical concept. So let me clarify that the near enemy of loving kindness is attachment. It means as long as I practice this, that person's behavior is going to change. I'm seeing to it by being holier and more, auspicious and more sacred than they are, because I'm praying for their happiness and harmony. I'm praying for their joy and contentment, and that they don't experience harm anymore. And I'm going to change them by this prayer. That's called attachment. Attachment to the outcomes. Now, you're not always that sleuthful, and you don't always catch yourself doing it. And I'm making a little parody of the voice tone that might be doing that schemingly. Of course, sometimes we're doing it, we think we're being like just wholly genuine and open, and we're doing our very best. I think that's worth acknowledging. Even if what happens is you got caught in some attachment loop with them. Like, I hope they change their behavior. I really do. Well, I'm only meditating on this loving kindness for myself right now. I really hope he changes his behavior or she changes her behavior. But no, I'm just practicing about myself right now. So, and you see this going back and forth. It's really an important time to say, wow, I'm probably still triggered. What can I do? I might first need to come to equanimity or self-compassion before I can go back to practicing loving kindness on behalf of the other. And there's a second option, and that is to practice loving kindness towards the part of yourself that has been vulnerable or tender or hurt. To practice loving kindness towards an aspect of you can make it more possible to come back to that loving kindness on behalf of another. If we don't catch ourselves at attachment, we can end up really diverting into ill will, where we actually hope the other person suffers the way they caused us to suffer. Now, I said this earlier tonight, like, who does that cost? Whose expense? I can tell you, I've had those thoughts. Usually it's in romantic relationship where the person I was involved with, and this happened on more than one occasion, so I think I played out my karma by now because I'm very happily married, and I have my best friend, and he's amazing. But I had to play out this karma twice with men who had trouble being honest and trouble with fidelity. And then their response to that was to shame and condescend me. So do you think I wanted them to suffer like I had suffered? Yeah. Yeah, I even hoped that it would really, like the relationship that they had been having while they were having one with me, that it would go down in really bad flames. It would devastate their life, and their children would hear about it too. And one didn't even have children yet, but when he did, the children were going to hear about it too. And this was like a whole storyline. That wasn't helping me to get over the hurt and the suffering. It didn't quicken my process of healing, it actually prevented it. So for both of those cases, I first needed to build my team. To go back to what I said to Beth about your dad, I really had to build my sense of team for empathy and kindness and inflate my own buoyancy and resilience. And then I practiced a lot of loving kindness towards both of those people. And I can say those are really uncolored historical thought patterns now. Just like Mary said about an old breakup, I empathize, but the thoughts aren't colored. I'm not saying I want to cross paths with those people and have social time. I don't need to change anything about it now. But to have that first grip mean that you can't get to loving kindness yet, you really need to check back and see how resilient am I? How buoyant am I? What is my equanimity status right now? Are my tires deflated? Do I need some help getting re-inflated for my own sense of care? And where's my compassion factor for myself in all of this? Am I stuck in blame for myself, and therefore I'm more likely to go to self-cruelty and to ill will towards the other? And will I like to live with myself under those circumstances? Not very much, no. There was a third meditation that I got to do with these two men, and that was called mudita. This I really practiced. This might sound stunning to some of you because I just gave a little sketch of the history, but mudita means practicing happiness for somebody else's happiness. So I started practicing happiness for the woman of infidelity that they had gone off with, happiness for their happiness together. And that was really fun. It was prior, it was like an inconceivable idea, but it turned into this meditative circus in my mind, wow, that's really very freeing. It's so possible. May you two be really happy together. May you be infinitely happy. May you experience joy and love and equanimity, because you'll each cause less suffering to other people as a result. So I went right from mudita to attachment. And then I had to unwind that part and come back to just basic mudita practice, just to come back to that. So this is the nature of the mind, right? It's circulating around in these particular ways, and the Brahmaviharas can provide a great roadmap for recognizing where your thoughts are now less colored and how to also lessen the coloring of painful thoughts that are in the way of your own experience of grace and love and belonging. Those of you who had the laughter of recognition right there, you have probably been through some similar storylines, and you see your own mind wandering like that. So just to note it, that when we experience that laughter together and that sense of camaraderie, that's also those are the seedlings of empathy, where you realize you're not that insane, you're not that alone, you aren't the only one with those sorts of thoughts. It's like a normal conditioned mind response, and there's something bigger for us to live in. There's another state to come from in terms of our consciousness, and you're amongst people who want that in their lives, including yourself. So it's fun to have that laughter and recognition, but I want you to seed it also as and here's how empathy can transform your life. You'll feel more understood and more kind-hearted towards yourself as a result. Any questions about what I've said there?
So that's kind of the aspect of the forgiveness of, really when you forgive others, it's you're forgiving yourself, kind of a thing that comes into the metta. And
yes.
It's that same kind of loving kindness of, the ones that's really suffering is if you don't forgive others for the sins they've done to you or whatever, then you're going to be the one that's really suffering.
Yes.
It's that bigger aspect of that.
We have said before, resentment is like ingesting poison and hoping somebody else feels sick to their stomach. Ingesting poison and hoping that they suffer. Yes, Claire.
I just was thinking that forgiveness isn't quite the word I was thinking of when she said that, because forgive, when I think of that, I think I'm okay with the situation that happened, and when I'm thinking, well, maybe I wasn't okay, but I recognize that it happened, and that I can be okay now, noting that it did happen. Does that make sense?
Yes. Yeah, maybe you're talking about acceptance.
Yes.
Mm-hmm. And perhaps there's a way that our culture hears the word forgiveness as condoning a certain behavior or giving our permission for that kind of behavior that had happened. But acceptance, I think, actually is a stage prior to forgiveness. The fact that we can be in reality and say, I accept this actually happened and I'm being honest with myself about it, that actually has to precede being able to forgive. And sometimes forgiveness towards a person who's caused harm, we're forgiving their naivete or their ignorance or their clumsiness or the way in which something painful in them caused harm to us. These could all be our hypotheses. We don't have to get it precisely to the person, and they don't have to know that we're working on it. It's forgiveness like these things is to free us up. So if I can forgive the part of somebody else that might have been clumsy or ignorant or exhausted and overwhelmed and didn't know what they were doing, if I can do that, I might do it also for myself more readily next time. And just to clarify that from a place of forgiveness, we don't become sloths, unlikely to evolve and grow and keep caring for our best possible self to express in our lives. We don't become lazy. Forgiveness actually lessens the dictatorship on the inside and frees up the possibility of kindness and grace emerging. Very different than resentment, but does have to start with that quality of acceptance you're talking about. How does that sound for you when I talk about forgiveness that way?
I think that when you're talking about empathy and noting that you can, like, pity is a lot different because pity you're looking down on someone and empathy you're feeling with them. And I feel like that there is a difference and that you can forgive and still feel empathy with yourself and with them.
Yeah, yeah. Have you heard of Fred Luskin? He's worth it. If you want to look into the science of forgiveness, Fred Luskin is a great teacher for that. I don't have time to go more into it tonight, but he's a really good teacher of forgiveness, and he's done a lot of deep understanding of how forgiveness helps the brain and works on our freedom as well as helping humanity. So his name is Fred Luskin, Luskin, Fred Luskin. Yeah. Well, before I close, I want to make note of equanimity. The near enemy of equanimity is detachment. It's kind of like aloofness. So if you find yourself, let's say, accepting but feeling aloof, you may say, maybe I'm not actually in equanimity, I'm just in my aloof part. I accept it, but I'm a little bit like cold about it, or I'm a little flatline about it. Acceptance itself actually should bring us to life. Just like forgiveness, it should revive us in our lives. But if you're falling into detachment or that aloof quality, that's the near enemy. The far enemy of equanimity is greed and aversion, where we may not realize that now our rage is emerging, and we really want things to be different. That's greed. Or our rage is emerging, and we really wish the world would just go away, and all the people in it, and all the disasters. That's aversion. So if you find that quality of detachment or aloofness coming to you, you might ask yourself, has my resilience gone down? Do I need empathy right now? Is there some part of me that went to flatline because I'm overwhelmed, I'm having a hard time caring? I might need some empathy for that myself, to revive your capacity for equanimity, for upekshanam, to revive your capacity for the other Brahmaviharas as well. Does that make some sense?
You said acceptance should cause you to feel...
Acceptance should bring us back to life. Yeah, radical acceptance would bring us back to life. I'm not saying back to life like now you're tap dancing. It brings us back to life, back to here and now in an embodied sense. Detachment and aloofness doesn't bring us to life. Yes, honey?
I was just thinking that could be hard to recognize. Like, I find from all my meditative practice, I'm much more detached and happy with that kind of thing. But then there might be that edge of detachment being aloof and not caring enough about something that I'm should be caring about.
Mm-hmm.
Because now I realize I'm like, whoa, wait, am I stepping too far back from certain situations that I should be actually
That's really, really well said.
have more compassion about?
Yes. Yes. So one of my litmus tests for myself is, am I experiencing the humanity in this event?
Right.
Am I experiencing the humanity of the other? Or do I feel cold and aloof, so I'm not tasting my humanity or theirs? And if the humanity has left me, it's a sign that I need some more internal care to come back to life.
That makes sense.
It's not a sign that I'm a bad person. I must have been overwhelmed or overscheduled or overtired, or I didn't have enough protein or sleep. So it's like some of the basics. But ask yourself if the humanity is still there. You still feel that in you. So we've heard of compassion fatigue. There's also equanimity fatigue, and burnout is real. So keep your eye on that. Mm-hmm. Okay, let's sit for a few moments of quiet together. Thank you. We only have 90 minutes together, and I'm sure it could go on for 90 days, as far as I'm concerned. But we have 90 minutes of precious time, and I like to close near to now, so we can honor that time frame. So you can rest your hands as you'd like in your lap. Invite your eyes to close or to become quiet. And listen for a few moments to what stirs for you in your heart, in your body. What might be coming to life? Yoga teaches us that if we restore the senses on a regular basis, then when we come back to employing the senses, we can experience exquisite beauty, love, satiation, a connection to life's preciousness. So again, I'll invite you to soften your senses and to say to them, thank you. Right now we're resting so that we can restore our capacity to come to life. And may we, as a result, see more beautifully, taste more exquisitely, listen more intently, feel more honestly, and experience life as it is. And join your hands together in Anjali Mudra. Thank you, everyone. Namaste.
Namaste.